Hitler and Goebbels are both there. Next thing you know, we're strapped onto Hitler's plane, the Richthofen, fastest and most powerful plane in all of Germany. On the flight, Goebbels is reading the papers, while Hitler studies a map of Europe. And I couldn't help but think, if this plane should crash, the whole history of Europe would be changed.
Well, thank you, young man, for that passionate presentation. But the Germans have their own unrest to worry about.
The Reichstag Fire was not unrest, it was a tactic. The Nazis now have an excuse to end all opposition.
But how can you be so certain?
Goebbels told me.
I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, which you heard a clip of at the start of the show.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the Trump administration and rising autocracy around the world. And so this is one of those weeks that's like several decades of news in 1 week. I know we say that every week, but this is really exceptionally true in this case after the brutal murder of George Floyd and the protests that have emerged in the aftermath. Andrea, I know you had things you wanted to launch into on this, so let's just kick it off.
Well, welcome to another episode that's going to sound a lot like Gaslit Nation's greatest hits, because Sarah and I have been talking about all these things, the rise of authoritarianism in America and worldwide. That's the whole theme of the show for many years. In fact, our podcast is essentially our regular phone calls with each other to help support each other through this extremely difficult time. That's what the podcast is. It's essentially Sarah and I just chatting away, helping each other connect what we're seeing, make sense of it all, add a historical context, just minus a lot of the swear words we usually use and minus a lot of the petty gossip we sometimes enjoy. But it is our phone calls. It is to help sustain each other through this. And we've decided in 2018 to share this conversation with anybody else who might need help in this department and in staying connected, staying engaged, making sense of it all. For us, it is disheartening that all these years pointing out the obvious, all of this is extremely obvious to anybody with any familiarity with the basic, tried and true, and reliable playbook of how authoritarianism works, past and present. It's not creative. It's not creative. It's not innovative. We've seen this all before in the early 1930s. In fact, authoritarian history must be part of civic education worldwide so that students around the world can easily spot these signs and take it very seriously and not laugh at authoritarian scholars who are pointing it out or call them hysterical or call them paranoid or write hit pieces and try to discredit them, because there's a massive problem of conformity and self-censorship in the press, which of course also existed during the rise of authoritarianism itself. George Orwell wrote about that constantly. He railed constantly against the self-censorship in the press. In fact, he wrote Animal Farm deliberately as a children's book so that people would catch on to what was happening and they would grab the book to be entertained, to be amused. George Orwell did that deliberately to break through the gaslighting in the media, the gaslighting in the press, the massive self-censorship and conformity and the careerism and all the fashionable people who are being celebrated in the worlds of publishing and media. And we're going through that all again. And we're frustrated. We are very frustrated. And I know anybody listening to this is very frustrated. And anybody listening to this is very scared right now and has every single right to be. Because Sarah and I did not open up these conversations to anybody that needs to hear them as for your own authoritarian fetish, should you have one. If you just enjoy listening in on two women chatting away. This was a deliberate strategy to help people stay engaged, to help alert people, to help bring together people who see the truth and see it clearly and need a place to go. And it is maddening to us that anybody should be surprised that we're at this point. If you've been along for the ride since the beginning and you've heard us tell you very deliberately that Vladimir Putin's mass murdering, terrorist, xenophobic terrorist regime was invading the US through its asset, through its puppet, Donald Trump. You heard us say that in 2016. You heard us say that, guess what? He's going to grab power, consolidate it. Our institutions will not hold up. They're going to be purged very quickly. Once he's in, it's going to be very difficult to get him out. We've been saying that since 2017. We were telling you that the goal is to make Ivanka Trump next. Now that's being widely reported. And then we've been telling you all of this, like that Robert Mueller was failing. He was not going to save us. All the things we've been telling you this entire time, people have in the media and on social media have laughed at us, called us despair trolls, have tried to silence us, ignore us. All of this has gone on. And no one should be surprised that we're at this point. And we're telling you once again to take what we're about to say on today's show very seriously, because we're not doing it for our own gratification. We're simply doing it because it's so painfully obvious to us. And it's infuriating that it's not obvious to more people. And so here's where we're going next. And you need to start preparing yourself. You need to start preparing your family. You need to have a serious conversation with yourself first. We are on a plane that is going down. So when the oxygen mask comes down, first you put it on yourself and then you put it on your child. I am the flight attendant of the apocalypse here. So what you first need to do is put your oxygen mask on yourself and then you go attend to the people in your family, the people that you're sheltering in place with. You have to accept right now that everything is going to get worse long before it gets better, okay? Everything is going to get worse before it gets better. We are headed into extremely dark times. All that we're seeing, all of this fascist pageantry that Donald Trump and his family are doing right now, that is a deliberate strategy to steal this 2020 election and stay in power. They desperately need to stay in power. Putin and Russia's elite desperately need them to stay in power. Because guess what? If Biden miraculously wins this election, then it's accountability time and people are going to be punished. And there's going to be more sanctions against Russia and Russia's going to look like a fool to the world. Putin's czarist imperialistic empire has not just financial interests in this, but its own pride on the line too. And that is a very motivating factor just as much as it is for Donald Trump and his criminal family. So we're in for dark days ahead. It's going to be a very shaky time. Stop putting a timeline on it. Stop expecting one day to wake up to good news. You're not going to see any good news for a very long time. We're in for moments of horror. And you just need to embrace that now as a fact to help prepare yourself so you are not demoralized. Because guess what? One of the weapons they're trying to use against us is demoralization. They're trying to break us down. They're trying to take away our hope. They're trying to make us do stupid stuff under pressure. They're trying to terrorize us. We have this show. Sarah and I have our conversations. We write. We have our writing projects. We get it all out. It is a matter to keep hope alive. That is why we keep telling you that art matters. That's why we keep telling you to make art. That's why we keep telling you to go to our action guide on gaslitnationpod.com and stay engaged, because the war is first and foremost in your mind. They're going to continue to try to terrorize. Do not let them terrorize you. Do not let them cower you into silence. You must stay engaged. You must prepare yourself for the worst now. And do not put a timeline. Have zero expectation on when you think this will end. Be open-ended about what we're in now. It's a process. The train has left the station. There's no turning back now. It's going to get worse long before it gets better. And just accept that fact now and just go to the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, go to the Gaslit Nation Reading Guide to understand how we got here, listen to our first 3 episodes again to understand how we got here, and just brace yourself for impact because it's all happening now. And we're not telling you that as some form, we're not like a criminal justice show. This isn't a crime thriller show, as those podcasts are very popular. This is a deliberate strategy to help people who need it, like we need each other, and refuse to abandon each other and to stay engaged. And it's dark days ahead, but we are ultimately going to get through it as long as we do not allow ourselves to be terrorized, because the war ultimately is in the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one thing I want to make clear, because yet again, we are seeing this litany of officials and pundits proclaiming their shock, proclaiming their surprise. People are feigning shock to avoid accountability. That is why they do that. They need desperately to claim that no one could have seen this coming, because that would mean that no one could have prevented it. This could have been prevented. It could have been slowed. It never would have been avoidable in its entirety. We were headed toward authoritarianism for years. We warned of this during the election cycle, that this would be the outcome. There were already pre-existing authoritarian tendencies or policies in this country. We have documented those extensively on this show. None of this should be a surprise. But, when you see people, especially elected officials, proclaiming that they just can't believe this is happening or that is happening, that is a cover for them. That is to change your expectations of what public servants are supposed to do, which is serve the public, which is protect the people. That is their actual job. They want you to be in this mentality where basically you have personality cults surrounding politicians, where you cheerlead them from the sidelines as they do nothing more than tweet. They're doing the same thing that you are, you as a regular citizen who doesn't have this obligation to actually create policy, to, make official edicts from above to try to stop this. I mean, I think every citizen has a baseline civic responsibility, but they are literally being paid to do this work, and they're claiming they don't know what's going on. No, they absolutely know what's going on. They have known the whole time. It has failed in front of their eyes, just as it has failed in front of ours, and they chose to do nothing. That was a choice that all of these people made, whether it was Comey or Mueller or Pelosi or the intelligence community or the FBI or a variety of people out there. And no, it's not uniform. It's not everyone across the board. And I do appreciate those who actually stepped out and fought and took the hits and told the truth. But the majority are now shrinking into this disgusting feigned ignorance in order to cover up their own complicity in this administration's crimes. Because at this point, complacency is complicity. There is no line between the two. And I'm so deeply, I'm sure I'm deeply frustrated. And this issue of feigning ignorance about authoritarianism is directly linked to feigning ignorance or shock about police brutality, about white supremacy, about the tyranny aimed at Black communities throughout the US. They have known about that for a very long time, and they have chose to either deny it exists, to put out little makeshift Band-Aid policies that don't actually address the structural roots of anything, or in the case of many politicians, and not just the GOP, Pelosi as well, to refuse to support Black Lives Matter. And I don't just mean the organization, I mean the principle, to just outright come out and say that. All of this is linked because when you're dealing with the US, to understand American authoritarianism, it is intrinsically linked to race. That is the original sin of this country. And that, as America becomes an autocracy, of course it's going to be rooted in white supremacy. All of our state-sanctioned authoritarian policies, or nearly all of them, were rooted in that, whether slavery, the genocide of Native Americans, internment camps of Japanese, Jim Crow laws, the prison industrial complex. What we're seeing now is that on hyperspeed. We are seeing accelerationalism, and we are seeing basically an attempt at selective genocide, whether in the treatment of the coronavirus, where you see, I believe at this point, it's 1 out of every 2,000 Black Americans has died in this pandemic, and in the brutality on the streets. And I think where the two may combine, which is people in close proximity being fired on with tear gas, not being protected from the virus, or from the police. So yes, we are in a lot of trouble. It was all predictable and therefore to some extent preventable. And do not let anyone off the hook when they say they had no idea that this could happen here. Because not only is it happening here, it has happened here, and therefore it will happen here. And Andrea will now explain to you what is to come and what kind of precursors there have been in history for actions like what the Trump administration is doing now.
Thank you, Sarah. So here we have Reichstag Fire time. We've had threats of this, of course. Trump flirting with the dictator of North Korea, threatening nuclear war, which he would love for the ratings and all that. But this is serious Reichstag Fire time. We saw Trump Jared Kushner, his daughter, Jared's wife, Trump's wife. No, just kidding. We saw Ivanka Trump in her stiletto heels and her big giant handbag, and William Wrecking Ball Barr, Trump's attack dog against American institutions and law enforcement. They walked out of the White House yesterday because Trump's ego was so wounded from reports getting out that he was hiding in a bunker. And to do this, they had riot cops fire on peaceful protesters, tear gas, and push them back. And we saw a video of this. It was a violent pushback against peaceful protesters. Also, Trump could hold a dictator-style fascist pageantry stunt in front of a historical church outside the White House and hold up a Bible and signal to his class war religious end times base to keep going, to keep helping inciting violence with their rhetoric, with their propaganda channels, with Fox News, with the law enforcement especially. So there's obviously historical precedent for this. And most famously, it's the Reichstag Fire. So as an important history lesson, as a reminder of what happened in early 1933, we're going to look back on the Reichstag Fire now. And, with help here from Smithsonian Magazine, which breaks it down, and we'll link to this in our show notes. And I'm going to read from this article now. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And where there's fire, conspiracy theories are sure to follow. At least that's what happened in Germany on February 27, 1933, when a sizable portion of the parliamentary building in Berlin, the Reichstag, went up in flames from an arson attack. It was the canary in the political coal mine, a flashpoint event when Adolf Hitler played upon public and political fears to consolidate power, setting the stage for the rise of Nazi Germany. Since then, it's become a powerful political metaphor. Whenever citizens and politicians feel threatened by executive overreach, like sending the military into states to break up protests, the Reichstag Fire is referenced as a cautionary tale. The economic unrest of the early 1930s meant that no single political party in Germany had a majority in the Reichstag, so fragile coalitions held the nation together. Meanwhile, the Nazis seized even more power, infiltrating the police and empowering ordinary party members as law enforcement officers. On February 22nd, Hitler used his powers as chancellor to enroll 50,000 Nazi SA men, also known as stormtroopers, as auxiliary police. 2 days later, Hermann Göring, Minister of the Interior and one of Hitler's closest compatriots, ordered a raid on communist headquarters. Following the raid, the Nazis announced, falsely, that they'd found evidence of seditious material. They claimed the communists were planning to attack public buildings. Now I'm going to stop here after reading from this article, which we'll link to in our show notes. I'm going to stop here and point out the Nazis set up the crime before committing the crime. The article goes on to point out that the group of Nazis who investigated the fire and later discussed its causes with historians covered up Nazi involvement to evade war crimes prosecution. We saw what we saw on Monday, and with chaos agents from the far right taking advantage of this violence, furthering this violence. There was a video of a police officer in New York holding up a white power symbol. You have Lieutenant Bob Kroll, the president of the Police Officers Federation of Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, who spoke at a Trump rally in October 2019. It's very clear what's going on here. Trump thrives off chaos. He needs chaos. He wants his supporters out in the street risking lives in violence. He wants this violence to escalate. You have Black and brown organizers in the streets trying to stop the violence, many of them leading peaceful demonstrations. Of course, you have opportunists on both sides. That's without question. You're always going to have idiots on both sides of the spectrum. But largely, these demonstrations have been peaceful. And peace is very much part of America's long history of organizing. You had, for instance, in the authoritarianism of the Jim Crow South, that civil rights movement confronting American authoritarianism, that was led by Black churches. And then you had Jewish communities coming down because they understood authoritarianism very well. And they were huge in the solidarity in confronting that violence. So understand that peace is protection. Peace is solidarity. Peace is resistance. That's built into the culture of the progressive movement. That's a very long tradition that we stand on. And what Trump desperately needs is to rip each other apart. He needs a civil war. Putin needs a civil war. There is even documentation going around held up by Russian opposition leaders saying that part of Putin's chaos agents were pitching an idea of helping feed a race war in America to destabilize us, to rip us apart. They want America to break apart into separate states. They want the United States to be over. It's about divide and conquer. This has all been documented. We've been talking about this since the start of the show. So peace is protection, peace is solidarity, peace is resistance. That's what organizers are leading with on the ground. That's our foundation. So I'm going to stop here and let Sarah add to this.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to continue with what happened as a result of the Reichstag fire, just to be clear, when the event happened on the 27th of February, 1933, the next day, the Reichstag fire decree was passed in which the Constitution was suspended. And so very abruptly, you had restrictions on free expression, freedom of the press, privacy, warrants, and then from there, you had, and I'm actually taking this from the Nuremberg Trials Twitter account, which has a bunch of primary source documents online. I highly recommend people go and look through this thread. The next section of the decree spoke of incarcerating anyone who incites disobedience or, quote, provokes or incites an act contrary to public welfare, which made it easier to round up offenders with no court involvement and throw them into camps. It then specified the death penalty for crimes such as treason, poisoning, arson, serious disturbance of the peace, or conspiring to kill a member of the government. And so this week, what we saw, of course, after these protests emerged was a scapegoat, was essentially a mythical entity, which they're calling Antifa. And Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist or anti-fascist, exists. It's a real thing. It is not a hierarchical, clearly defined, clearly bound organization. It consists of a lot of people who oppose fascism and express it in different ways. You may remember that the people who were punching Nazis in Charlottesville in 2017, many of them were members of Antifa, and I'm glad they were punching Nazis. I don't think anyone should be criticized for that. I think we should be grateful that they were doing that. There have also been a number of incidences captured on film in which we see white people dressed in clothing that's typical of Antifa, destroying stores, lighting fires, committing, crimes. And I want to be clear here that the property damage we're seeing does not remotely matter in terms of importance relative to the crimes that are being committed toward people like George Floyd, toward the countless victims of police brutality. And any video you see makes it very clear that it is the police who are the most violent, who are themselves breaking the law, who are gassing people, who are beating people, who are abusing people. And so that said, there are a number of white randos walking around majority Black neighborhoods, burning down buildings like Black barbershops, which are very unlikely to be the target of a progressive Black resistance. And I don't know who these people are. I think it's very difficult to tell. I'm someone who covered Ferguson firsthand for months because I live in St. Louis, not just when the cameras were there, not just on the isolated weeks in which there was actual arson and violence. The vast majority of those protests were peaceful, but there are definitely interlopers. Like there were people who came in and the community here in the St. Louis metro area was like, get the fuck out. Because if you are committing these crimes, we are going to be the ones who go to jail. Like you're white, you're going to get a pass. Nothing is going going to happen to you. And sometimes things would happen occasionally to white people who participated in these protests. But the structure itself is what you're protesting, the structure of this excuse to abuse and incarcerate Black people who have often done absolutely nothing and blame them for crimes committed by white people. And there's, a lot of different things going on. There is, as Martin Luther King famously said, riots is an expression of the unheard, where you're seeing genuine rage, from all sorts of people because these atrocities were never remedied. But then you're seeing opportunists who are taking advantage of this. And I do wonder if some of these people dressed up Antifa style are white supremacists. I wonder if some of them are undercover police or just simply police. I wonder if some of them are Trump sympathizers. It's difficult to tell. But anyway, that's why it was so convenient for Bill Barr when he came out and announced, quote, that the violence instigated and carried out by Antifa and other similar groups in connection with the rioting is domestic terrorism and will be treated accordingly. This is such a typical tactic of an authoritarian regime. They will take an amorphous group, they will expand the definition so that it is as wide as humanly possible. They will deem it a terrorist threat, and then they will use that as a pretext to round up anyone, to round up journalists, to round up activists, to round up protesters, to round up bystanders who merely witnessed atrocities. I covered a very similar or prominent example of this in Uzbekistan. In 2005, there was this event known as the Andijan Massacre, in which about 10,000 people came out to protest in the city of Andijan in eastern Uzbekistan. They were protesting all sorts of stuff: human rights abuses, economic abuses, poverty, and the incarceration of a bunch of Muslim businessmen who the government found threatening. I've written multiple papers about this event, so I'm going to make a long story short. You could look it up if you want more. But basically what happened is they hoped the government would come out and actually address the protesters. Instead, the military came out, fired on the protesters and just on bystanders, pregnant women, children, killed about 800 people, and then tried to cover it up. And they tried to cover it up by blaming an amorphous Islamic group called Acromia, which didn't really exist. Like, nobody on the ground would recognize it, would define themselves as a member of Acromia. It was something that they had created, and they had put the groundwork in play years before. There were state officials working both within the government and in universities that were saying that Acromia was a terrorist organization, and that anyone who was linked to Acromia or in Acromia could therefore be thrown in jail. And they did that. They locked up a lot of innocent people, and other innocent people fled the border and became exiles and began publishing documentation of these events online. I debunked the Acromia narrative, and as a result of that publication, became banned from Uzbekistan. So this is familiar territory for me, and this is real, and this is very frightening to see these kind of tactics used here, because I think that they are going to increasingly label anyone who opposes Trump as being in Antifa, and anyone who opposes fascism as being in Antifa, because it is anti-fascist. So if you've been online, like me and Andrea and other scholars of fascism and other opponents of fascism, which you should all be because it's fascism, then you are going to likely be targeted by this administration. I don't know in what form, but they are going to make this as expansive as possible. And it's just incredibly dangerous on so many levels. First, to have this scapegoat, but secondly, to just openly be declaring, like, yes, we oppose people who oppose fascism. We are fascists. Like, they are so blatant about this. They have been blatant the whole time. From the minute that Trump announced his platform, which had, the classic hallmarks of fascism, of scapegoating minorities, wanting to use excessive military force, claiming that he himself is the government, saying he wouldn't accept the election results. He did that back in 2016. He's going to do it again now. Those were all blatant signs. And again, I am so furious that people refused to admit this, because it wasn't a theory. It was all right there, and the motivations behind refusing to just describe what was right before your eyes, even without analysis, just describing it as it actually occurs. The refusal of people to do this is so disgraceful. It is such an incredible blight because real people suffer, and we are seeing the result of that suffering right now. We are seeing that suffering in the streets. We are seeing the abuse of Black protesters. We are seeing journalists getting attacked in ways that they normally weren't before. One of my friends, Linda Tirado, is an excellent writer whose book you should buy. She now is blind in one eye because she was shot by police with rubber bullets. And Linda covered Ferguson as well. One thing that's markedly different now than it was during Ferguson is that when we were all out there then, that was kind of one of the first big protests where people had cell phone cameras and they were using Vine and they were doing live streaming and all of these other things to bring what was actually happening on the ground to the masses in a way that went beyond what was being portrayed on cable news. And the police hated this. They absolutely hated being filmed. They didn't want their brutality to be captured. Some of them, of course, were flaunting their military strength, their equipment, their tear gas. They wanted to be intimidating, that was for sure. But they didn't want to be caught and risk legal repercussions. They didn't want a DOJ investigation. And I think to some extent, they didn't want the widespread disapproval of the public. That is gone now because it is not Eric Holder and Barack Obama. It is Bill Barr and Trump and 4 years of streamlined white supremacist militant movements, of all of them being played down, the threat of them being played down, the infiltration of white supremacists into police departments being played down. We are seeing that result. We are seeing an emboldened police force that doesn't mind being recorded, plowing a car into a crowd of people, beating people over the head, grabbing protesters who are merely making impassioned speeches about peace or about justice and brutalizing them. They have the exact same mindset as the Trump administration does, which is they don't mind being caught, they mind being punished. So my question is, who is actually going to punish them?
No one, if they continue to get away with this and consolidate power and the chaos becomes so great and the October surprise they're certainly planning is so great that even though Congress legally is the one that has a right to change the election date if needed, there could be so much chaos that the election is suspended automatically because of the chaos. So yeah, just get ready for this. Get ready for this. So one point that we keep making on the show is that in authoritarian regimes, the police, the secret police, are recruiting tools for sadists. All the sadists find each other. Who do you think was carrying out Stalin's purges? The chief of the secret police at the time was an infamous sadist who liked to torture people personally. You've seen young Russians risking their lives and freedom, putting their bodies on the line, protesting against Putin's corruption. And you see them being sadistically beaten and manhandled by these riot police. That's all a recruitment tool. All of this violence that we're seeing is the legalization of the KKK. It's, what we've seen with the child trafficking, the reports of sexual abuse of children and people being held in detention centers on the border, the human rights crisis on the border, all the growing camp system on the border. That's all a recruitment tool for sadists. This is all playing out before our eyes, and Trump's base supports it and loves it. One thing I want to point out is what happened less than 1 month after the Reichstag Fire, that event that essentially gave cover to the Nazis to consolidate all power. What happened 1 month after the Reichstag Fire? The first concentration camp was opened at Dachau, less than a month after the Reichstag Fire. And that opened with the arrival of something like only 200 people. And the Nazis would go on to kill over 6 million people. So less than 1 month after the Reichstag Fire, the first concentration camp opened. And right now we have a growing camp system on the border. And right now we have a very loose term of what the enemy of the state is, including journalists, including activists. And as Sarah said, that term is broadly thrown around in order to consolidate power and justify throwing political opposition and journalists into prison. You have Mark Morgan, the acting commissioner for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. He tweeted, just yesterday, CBP personnel have deployed to the National Capital Region to assist law enforcement partners. These protests have devolved into chaos and acts of domestic terrorism by groups of radicals and agitators. CBP is answering the call and will work to keep DC safe. I don't feel safe. We have a right to assembly. We have a right to protest. We have a right to free speech in this country. So understand that first they came for the asylum seekers. Who do you think is going to be next if they get away with stealing another election?
Yeah, exactly. And, I have to say, the issue of the camps is one of the things that's haunted me from this administration. I feel like a giant turning point was the creation of camps and of migrant family separation in mid-2018. In the sheer horror of that, in the refusal of officials, with the exception of some like Ocasio-Cortez, to call them what they were, which is concentration camps. And I've wondered, they've invested so much into this. What exactly was it going to be used for? And where does it stop? And what I fear is that the abuse of these migrant families, this is one of the worst things that this administration has done. And that's saying a lot. I think it was a test run also for a broader project. And I worry about the combination of targeting these protesters and activists, denying them the freedom of assembly with a pandemic, with a public health crisis, and with a disease that we still don't fully understand. And, epidemiologists have grown strangely quiet in the last week as these protests go on. They're not really out there giving tips about safety. And, you do see people practicing some of the precautions that are recommended, wearing masks and so forth. But I worry what will happen when these activists are just thrown into regular jails, which is a major spreading point of the disease. And I wonder if they're going to, as I predicted in earlier episodes, weaponize the coronavirus to basically create a leper type class, to basically say, we need to separate these people. We need to take them away. Oh, it's not about their politics. It's about the fact that they tested positive for COVID-19. And I worry that they may use these camps for that purpose, that we may see a combination of the exploitation of a genuine public health threat with fascism, because that's what administrations like this do. They don't waste that kind of opportunity. And we also have seen what looks like selective genocide, or an attempt at it, where this disease has disproportionately hit Native American reservations. It has killed, they estimate 1 out of every 2,000 Black Americans, which is just a horrifying statistic. And I think has also led to a lot of the outrage about the general treatment that Black Americans experience. There are so many horrific ways that this could go. And I am putting these possibilities out there. And the reason I do this isn't to scare people. It's to alert them. It's to warn them that these are the kind of tactics that are practiced by regimes like this. And if you wait until they have already entrenched them, you are not going to be able to stop them. That's the lesson of our show. That's the lesson of the last few years. So when Andrea and I go through these possibilities and lay them out, and we present to you worst case scenarios, is because we don't want these scenarios. We don't want this to happen at all. We want people to be vigilant. Every founding document about democracy calls for eternal vigilance. You can't just kick back and assume that people are going to be good and that problems are going to solve themselves. And we have already a lesson in the last 4 years about the strength of our institutions, which is almost non-existent, which is extremely weak, about the moral character of our leaders, which is utterly lacking with a few exceptions, about their political will in terms of the opposition, which is not there. They have acted as accomplices. They have acted as appeasers. So we feel the urge to warn people about this. And if you see this moving in this direction, do everything in your power to stop it. Support the groups who've been fighting for migrant rights, support the groups who are fighting for Black rights, support the groups who are fighting against the prison industrial complex, and assume the worst. If you assume the worst, you will be prepared. If it doesn't happen, you get to be pleasantly surprised.
I would love to be pleasantly surprised.
That would be a novel feeling these days.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Putin and Trump, yes, this racism, the deep wound of racism in America is homegrown. It belongs to us. It's the original sin that built America. America was built on the genocide of Native Americans and the genocide, the authoritarianism of the institution of slavery, which didn't fully go away. Of course, it morphed into different forms, from Jim Crow laws to the prison industrial complex to a judicial system that continues to treat Black men and women, people of color, like chattel, feeding money, feeding greed to the prison industrial complex, and so forth. So this is ours. America was built on this. It's a far-right country. Confederate symbols, the Confederate flag, Confederate statues that have been allowed to exist in our country for far too long, those are symbols of Nazism. That's Nazism. That's an ideology of hate. That's an ideology of genocide. The Confederate movement that exists in America, that's become a global movement, a far-right movement, helped by Steve Bannon and Putin and others. You have Putin's terrorists invading Ukraine right now. What do they have as their symbol? The U.S. Confederate flag. They've adapted that as their symbol. The Confederate flag is equivalent to the Nazi flag. It fights for an ideology of hate. It's dehumanizing, and it needs to go. And America, anybody outside of America listening to this wondering what's going on, why is our house on fire? It's because America was birthed out of the horror of genocide. It's like Nazi Germany on so many levels. It is. And that's just a reality. And it's very difficult for us to see that because we also have a beautiful side of America. We have two Americas. We've also been a promised land historically for asylum seekers. My parents were born in refugee camps and came here and experienced the American dream and built the American dream for themselves. But a lot of those opportunities that they were able to take advantage of, those are disappearing today under this far-right, corporate, complicit, growing income inequality that's taken over our country. The worst of us is now in control of the White House, the Supreme Court, and the Senate, and many state offices across this country. And so it's not enough for us to tell everyone how so not racist we are. It's not enough anymore for us to do that. We have to now be anti-racist. We cannot politely condone Confederate symbols anymore, considering that they're the equivalent of Nazi symbols. And we need to stomp out Nazism. We need to stomp out the fascists here on our soil. This needs to end now. And that's what we're witnessing. We're witnessing this confrontation, and it's going to be painful. It's going to be scary. It's going to have moments of absolute terror, and it's going to take years. It's not going to go away anytime soon, but it's a necessary process that we need to finally undertake. It's a process of healing. It's a process of understanding that Black people have been extraordinarily patient. They've been extraordinarily patient. And that's also a theme throughout history. If you look at what led to the Russian Revolution, the far-right Tsarist family, and the dehumanizing poverty of the Tsarist regime in Russia, the disastrous entry of Russia into World War I, how people across the Russian Empire suffered so greatly. They were pushed to a breaking point where they had no choice but to finally overthrow the Tsar. Again, you saw, in the French Revolution, all of those beautiful ideas of the Enlightenment, Rousseau and others, that was a white male revolution. It was equality for white men. Women were left out of it. People of color were left out of the Enlightenment. But what you had was a French Revolution led by women. Women marched on the Bastille. Women marched to Versailles. Why? Because women were starving and their children were starving, and women were in charge of feeding the families, and they were pushed to a breaking point. Even though they were left out of all of the literature that was circulating on calls to revolt, women were the ones that were major catalysts in the French Revolution because they were pushed to a breaking point. You saw that again in Ukraine. You saw investigative journalists into Putin's puppet's corruption. Yanukovych, the Donald Trump of Ukraine, that he and his family stole an estimated $30 billion to $100 billion. They were in Putin's pocket. They were the governor for the Kremlin of Ukraine, essentially. Ukrainians themselves were pushed to such a breaking point of deep poverty and corruption, and then a series of these so-called dictatorship laws that criminalized free speech and other rights in Ukraine. Ukrainians were pushed to such a breaking point that they finally had to overthrow that tyrant. Black people in America have been extraordinarily patient, given how many of them have been murdered on camera by law enforcement. And law enforcement play the victims every time and ramp up the brutality. And you have complicit actors in the Democratic Party who are afraid, are intimidated to stand up to law enforcement. And essentially what law enforcement has become in this country is there's a very powerful strain in law enforcement in America that is essentially a legalized version of the KKK. They know what they're doing, it's intentional, and it's happening before our eyes. And Black people have been extraordinarily patient. And what you saw in these last couple days, they're at a breaking point, and this breaking point is going to continue. We have everybody stuck at home. Workers do not have to go into the office. Kids are out of school for the summer. People are being told to shelter in place. Going out to a protest where you have to wear a mask. It's actually for your own protection to wear a mask in protests because we have such a militarized police force. So actually protests are a difficult subject right now given the very volatile situation we're in. But what I'm telling you is that it's protest season now. It's going to continue because people do not need to show up to an office. Many of them are out of work because of this Great Depression economic crash, and kids are out of school for the summer, and they have to be wearing masks anyway, and a mask is a necessary item to protest safely. So all of this is going to continue, and when you watch it continue, which is inevitable, and Trump is going to be stoking the flames of violence, what you need to keep in mind is that Black people have been extraordinarily patient. They are part of a long history of people being pushed to the limit and a breaking point and being externally patient. And then finally, they have no other choice now. If you want to ease off the pressure, every single person in a leadership position, every citizen of this country has to start listening, taking this very seriously. It's not enough anymore for us to tell everyone how so not racist we are. We have to now be anti-racist, and we have to stomp out the Nazi ideology that has hijacked very powerful offices across our country.
And one thing, I mean, I'm not sure we've even addressed it directly on the show, that has changed the situation and upped the ante, is that Trump wants to deploy the military into states.
Well, that's the Reichstag Fire. The
Reichstag Fire. But what we have here is, an entity separate from the police. But I think in the view of Trump, I mean, what they're trying to create, it reminds me of like the militia of Uzbekistan. And I know this word gets used differently in different post-Soviet countries, where you have this entity, this brutal force of surveillance and abuse that's not quite the military, not quite the police, as we see them in a Western way. And that is just such a point of fear for people in these countries. Like, it's something, every dissident I interviewed from Uzbekistan would tremble at the word militia. And I feel like that is what they are attempting to create in the United States. And the fact that there were so many people who went on and on about how in the end, the military will save us and the generals will save us, and Mattis and Kelly and McMaster will obviously speak out, when the time is right. This is the fucking time. And we know what side they're on. We saw that yesterday. So any delusion that the military is somehow going to sweep in and make things right instead of make things worse is out the window. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope that when it comes down to it, I hope that when, Trump commands them to shoot innocent Americans, that they don't do it, that they refuse to, that they remember, what their actual job is. But I'm so appalled, not just that this is happening, but by the lack of any kind of organized response from people who wield far much more political power than us, or more money. Like Robert Reich from the New York Times, he tweeted, where is Congress? Where's the Supreme Court? Where are the mayors and governors, living former presidents? Where are the university presidents, foundation heads, religious leaders, corporate leaders, union heads, editors, and publishers? All must stand up to Trump's madness. He tweeted that in reaction to the kind of disgusting way that Trump's action, which is just a classic fascist move. I mean, as you've brought up the Reichstag Fire, like that was completely appropriate. They're not treating it with that appropriateness. Like, I don't know if you have it on hand, the New York Times headline from the morning.
Oh, yeah. The New York Times, the handmaiden to power, whether it's marching us into war in Iraq or printing disinformation about saying the FBI sees no connection between Trump and Russia just days before the 2016 election and so forth. So the latest from the newspaper of Power, from the New York Times. The headline is, "As chaos spreads, Trump vows to end it now." Trump is the chaos. Trump desperately needs chaos in order to steal this election and stay in power. Putin, who helped bring him to power, desperately needs chaos in order for Trump to stay in power, in order to avoid sanctions from the US. So again, the New York Times, another critical election with democracy on the brink. The New York Times is choosing to be not the newspaper of record, but the New York Times is the newspaper of power.
Yeah, it's disgusting, and it streamlines it. It mainstreams it. They've done this many times in the past. We've mentioned this on many shows, but this is such a critical point. Like, this is the time where you need to speak in plain language, where you need to condemn fascism, and you need to just talk bluntly about what Trump is doing, what he has done, and what his administration is capable of doing. And it is deeply frustrating that when they emerge to do that, it's, shaped in this way. And then also this kind of mealy-mouthed, weak-willed response from our leaders, that we don't have an emergency session of Congress. We don't even have statements, calling on him to resign. I mean, of course, he's not going to resign, but just saying that, or cutting the purse strings, or using every weapon in your arsenal. This is not a regime that behaves normally. It is not behaving as a democratic administration, and it never has. And it's openly declared its intent to not be a democracy. So if you're going to oppose it from within the bounds of Congress, you need to be creative in your own approach. If they're going to do things unconventionally, then you need to do it as well. And to just tweet out these little statements like, "Oh, I'm deeply concerned," or "I'm so shocked." It's like, my God, our country's going to die. Like, we've been very clear about that for the last 4 years. People are going to die while fighting for it. This was the point that we wanted to avoid. This is what happens when you have an utter failure of accountability and a failure to even identify reality as reality, because you're so concerned with protocol or prestige, or maybe there are darker agendas involving blackmail, bribery, donor money, loyalties to other countries above the US, what have you. It's a different situation for everyone. But what I know is you can't go by the book when the book is burning. And that is a lesson that Congress has absolutely failed to learn. And they need to learn it now, and they need to learn it fast, because we're already past the bounds of too late. Right now, it's a matter of damage mitigation, of making this less of a catastrophe, and not even of avoiding catastrophe entirely, because we're there.
Yep. All right. So speaking of questions of loyalty, whether to our country or foreign power, so all of this, the original sin of slavery, that's ours. America owns that. And Putin's mass murdering terrorist regime is, of course, going to take advantage of that. They desperately need to avoid accountability. We should understand, to everybody on the left and on the right, why Putin and Trump make such a good team, why there's so much solidarity between them. They spoke on the phone just recently. Trump keeps pushing to get Russia back into the G7, making it the G8 again. They were kicked out of the G8 because of Putin's invasion of Crimea and then East Ukraine. The other G7 countries keep saying no, and Trump is pushing for this. This is on Putin's wish list, of course. What unites Trump and Putin? Again, they regularly speak on the phone. So there's organized crime, there's money laundering, there's attack on the press, censorship, propaganda. They both incite violence, especially against opposition leaders and the press. They both want to stay in power. They purge, they consolidate power, they encourage sadistic police and law enforcement tactics, and they want a deep state, police state. And there's something more. Let me just read to you from a piece that I wrote, which we'll link to in the show notes, for Forbes 5 years ago, on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. This is going to explain to you yet another reason why Trump and Putin are made for each other. So as I'm reading this, remember, I wrote this 5 years ago, but this could very much be describing Trump and his base today. Reggie Yates is clearly fearless. The Black British reporter traveled to Russia for the BBC to understand the recent rise of fascism. In addition to discovering a mini Comic-Con glorifying Putin, he was also harassed for being Black at a nationalist march founded by President Putin and was calmly informed in one interview that the mixing of races is impure and leads to mutations. Yates is mixed race. The charming and buoyant reporter at first smiles through the absurdity, but the bigotry gets to be too much for him. His emotions begin to show in his face. Twice, we see Yates abruptly end an interview and rush for the exit. Xenophobia has been an upward trend in Russia, even before recent tensions with the West. Yates gives us a stomach-turning glimpse of a montage of YouTube videos celebrating vicious attacks on immigrants, including a man sitting on a bench who is suddenly kicked in the face. He also interviews an immigrant who was randomly stabbed on the street, only to have the doctor refuse to treat him because he was an immigrant. A 2013 poll by the independent Levada Center found that 69% of Russians believe the country has too many immigrants. The discrimination even targets citizens of post-Soviet countries and regions, like the Caucasus. Ironically, Putin and his supporters call for the return of the Soviet Union, yet don't want to live alongside the very same people Russia once colonized. A vile pride has taken over the country. It is the design of a dictator who severely restricts press and internet freedoms, legislates homophobia, and exalts the invasion of much smaller neighbors. Journalists and opposition leaders have been arrested and murdered under Putin's watch. Soviet history is even being rewritten to glorify Joseph Stalin. Russia invests in right-wing parties in Europe to purchase influence and divide the EU. It has become a paradise to famous white supremacist leader Preston Wigington, who spends part of the year there. He recently organized a Texas A&M University lecture by Alexander Dugin, an influential Russian political scientist who called for the genocide of Ukrainians and a world war to usher in the end times. Putin may have created a hate machine, but he has become the face of a monster that will outlive him. Once Putin is gone, another autocrat will take his place. Fascism in Russia is not going away anytime soon. Russians will tell you that they need a strong leader. As one Russian-Ukrainian woman explained to me, it's because they fear a return to the volatility of the Yeltsin years, when the collapse of communism plunged everything into chaos. They also fear, she says, ethnic minorities rising up against them, the, quote, real Russians, and creating a civil war. Fascism has become a sort of gravity holding Russia together. That's where we are. It's xenophobia. And that's why we keep telling people on the left to stop amplifying Russian state media like RT. Stop going on RT. Do not support Russian state propaganda. It's a xenophobic state. Domestic Russian propaganda is like Fox News on acid. It's a fever dream of xenophobia and disinformation. Again, these are two culturally aligned. Trump has his mentor in Putin. That's what we're up against. Now, obviously, this was another Gaslit Nation Greatest Hits where we covered a lot of what we're up against. We would not have a show if there wasn't hope, if there wasn't a reason to continue to stay engaged. There absolutely is. And if you want a place to look for hope, go to the Gaslit Nation Action Guide and gaslitnationpod.com. In the show notes, we're going to share a link to Congresswoman Barbara Lee and her PAC to help get progressives elected. We're going to share links to 2 other essential groups working on the all-important local state level, every district, and Future Now. If you're scared, if you're furious, channel that energy and donate what you can to these critical organizations working on the all-important state level to build a more progressive union. We are in the fight of our lives. Stop thinking in terms of election cycles and think in terms of decades. We need to fight now, plant the seeds now, and 10 years from now, we can be in a much safer place.
And for those who think there's no point in going forward, all is lost, et cetera, we still have not only a moral obligation, but an open demonstration that we still do wield some leverage, that the people, and their power collectively are still a threat. If they thought it wouldn't matter if you voted, they would not work so hard to prevent you from doing it. If they thought that the truth didn't matter, then they wouldn't work so hard to suppress it. And if they thought that your right to assembly was no big deal and would yield no repercussions, they would not have these blatant abuses and arrests out in the street. They fear a critical, independent-minded populace that is relentless, that that is relentless in its pursuit of truth, that's relentless in its pursuit of justice, and that makes demands, that doesn't just roll over and lie dead. I don't know what the outcome of this will be, but I know that I'm not rolling over and I'm not backing off. And I know that Andrea isn't backing off either. And I know that our listeners aren't either. And so if you're listening to this and you feel alone, you're not. There are millions. There are people out in the street. There are people in their homes who can't protest or are afraid to, but, are very much of like mind. We are living under the tyranny of the minority, but we are the majority. We are not the silent majority. We are the loud majority, and we need to keep it even louder in the weeks to come.
It is your duty not to burn your own house down for anger with an enemy. It is your duty to fortify your own house so that you may be a house of refuge in times of organization. And now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. It is time to beat up prosecutors you don't like at the voting booth. It is time to hold mayoral offices accountable, chiefs and deputy chiefs. Atlanta is not perfect, but we're a lot better than we ever were, and we're a lot better than cities are. I'm mad as hell. I woke up wanting to see the world burn down yesterday because I'm tired of seeing black men die. He casually put his knee on a human being's neck for 9 minutes as he died like a zebra in the clutch of a lion's jaw. And we watch it like murder porn over and over again. So that's why children are burning to the ground. They don't know what else to do. And it is the responsibility of us to make this better right now. We don't want to see one officer charged. We want to see 4 officers prosecuted and sentenced. We don't want to see targets burning. We want to see the system that sets up for systemic racism burnt to the ground.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Direct Relief at directrelief.org, which is supplying much-needed protective gear to first responders working on the front lines in the U.S., China, and other hard-hit parts of the world.
We encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate at the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Wissenberg, Nick Barr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Adam Levine,
Alabama,
Alan Liu,
Allison Marino,
Ann Marshall,
Brian Tajudin,
Tahudin, I think, Kai Gillis,
Carol Golstad,
Catherine Anderson Carina,
Charles Olthier,
David Porter,
Diana Gallagher,
D.L. Singfield,
Elizabeth Dove,
Emmy,
Eric Kaplan,
Arena Guardia,
Ethan Mann,
Evan Rosemore,
Fontaine Carpenter,
George Hughes,
Greg Kreimer,
Gustav Halsby,
Janet Robinson,
Jared Lombardo,
Jason Benke,
Jason Rita,
Jeff Thompson,
Jennifer Slavic,
Jens Eilstrup Rasmussen,
Jans,
Joel
Newman,
John Astrick,
John Laughlin,
John Ripley,
Karen Humphreys,
Kate Cotton,
Katie McHugh,
Katie Masuris,
Keith Gottschalk,
Kelly Ranson,
Kevin Gannon,
Kevin M. Garnett,
Christy Vital,
Lawrence Graham,
Leo Chalupa,
Lisa LaFlame,
Lorraine W. Todd,
Lynn Schneider,
Mandy Farapor,
Marcus J. Trent,
Margaret Moe,
Mary Wong,
Matt Perez,
Maureen Murphy,
Michael Stinoff,
Michael Wooldridge,
Michelle Dash,
Mike Tripico,
Nicole Spear,
Oliver Ash,
Pamela Newport,
Ray Alba,
Rhonda White,
Rich Craw,
Richard Smith,
Robert Wedginski,
Sandra Kelnand,
Sonia Bodanovich,
Sharon Hattrick,
Solomon Hikes,
Tanya Chalupa, who's currently babysitting,
Victoria Nordgren,
Victoria Olson,
William Barry Reeves,
Ren. Thank you all so much for your support. We could not make this show without you.